Hello. So this school year, we're going to do a horrible histories class. We do in different books on different subjects. The first one that we're going to do is going to be the Vicious Vikings. You might have heard a lot about Vikings before. Maybe you hadn't heard anything about Vikings. But there's a really famous Viking that most people have heard about called Leif Erikson. There's even a Leif Erikson Day. And so a lot of people think that Leif Erikson probably was the first person that actually found America. So he actually found America. He called it Vinland. And because Vin is a Viking word for pasture. And there was just all this land he found. But they think probably he was the first one. And he even had some fights with some of the Native Americans that were here. But there's not a whole lot about Leif Erikson that we're going to read about in the Vicious Vikings. This is more facts that you might not know about Vikings. So we'll start at the beginning. About where did Vikings come from? Vikings actually came from Scandinavia. Now Scandinavia is what we think of today as Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Now whenever they started attacking people called the Saxons. The Saxons lived in England. They had moved to England after the Romans left. And so the Vikings and the Saxons were enemies. That's who the Vikings usually attacked. So the question is, why did the Vikings decide to start attacking the Saxons? I'm going to give you several choices to choose from, and I want you to try to guess which one you think is the right answer. Okay? Number 1. It was getting too crowded in Scandinavia, and the Vikings wanted more land. Number 2, the monasteries were an easy way to get rich and quick in treasures and slaves. Number 3, there was too little food in Scandinavia because the soil was useless. It hadn't been kept very fertile because the Vikings didn't know how to fertilize their land to make it keep growing. Number 4, there was too much food. And they had grown all this food and they needed someone to trade it with. Number 5, the Viking rules meant that younger sons got no land from their fathers when they died. So they had to go overseas and take someone else's land. Number 6, some pretty vicious kings took over in the 9th century in Scandinavia. Many Vikings sailed off to escape. Number 7, a change in climate made Scandinavia very cold and uncomfortable. It rained all the time and it was miserable. Even more miserable than England, where it rained all the time too. Number 8, there was a sudden shortage of herring in the North Sea. That was their main food supply. Number 9, sea trade was growing in the north of Europe. More trade meant more chances for piracy, and the Vikings loved to be pirates because that's basically what they were. Vikings were the first pirates. Number 10, the Vikings enjoyed sailing and fighting, and they didn't want to just stay home and sit around being farmers. Okay, so which one do you think might be the right answer? Well, the right answer is that all of them could be the right answer. The truth is that nobody knows why Vikings started attacking. They don't know why. They just decided one day, let's go make enemies with the Saxons and attack them and try to take their land. So we have no idea why that happened. Just like we have no idea why the dogs are barking. Okay, now one of the things that Vikings are known for are stories. They love to tell stories. They were on all these boats a lot, and there were a lot of them on there. They didn't have a whole lot to do, so they were known for telling these long stories. There's Viking tales that have carried over for years and years. Now, the Vikings believed in different gods. Now, we know that's silly. We know there's just one God. But the Vikings believed that there were all these different gods that did different things. One of the gods that they were the most fascinated with was Thor. Have you ever heard that name before? So they thought that one of the gods was Thor. And they used to tell this story all the time, and it has carried down so that we can know it too. Thor was the god of strength and hard work. He was also the god of storms. Now, this would have been important to Vikings because they were really scared of storms. They were on these ships, and if you're out in the middle of all this water and a huge storm comes, you're in a lot of trouble because there's nowhere to go to escape it. People believed that he made thunder by riding across the skies on his chariot. And Thor was also the protector of the other gods with his huge weapon, which was a hammer. Now, Thor and his hammer were very close. They were never apart. Thor kept his hammer with him all the time. He was fond of it and had given it a name, Joldar. But one day, and what a day it must have been, he awoke to find his hammer was gone. It had been stolen by his arch enemies, the giants. Now, the only way Thor could get back his hammer was if he could persuade Freya, who was the goddess of love, to marry the Lord of the Giants. Now, Freya really wanted a husband, but she did not want a giant for a husband. So she refused. So what was Thor going to do? He's got to get his hammer back. So he decided he would pretend to be Freya and fool the giants. So he dressed up in a wedding dress, and he wore this gold necklace that Freya always wore. Now, Thor did not look like a woman. He had a beard, and he had huge muscles. So it wasn't really a very good costume. Plus, he gets there and he ate like a pig. They said that he ate 8 whole salmon, a whole ox, and 3 barrels of stuff to drink. Now, after this, Thor's hammer was brought into the feast to bless the bride. Thor could not wait any longer. He jumped up and he said hello to his best friend, the hammer. The disguise fell off and he said, "I want my hammer back." And after a fight, the big, soft Thor got his hammer back, never to lose it again. Now, there are 2 lessons that we need to learn. If you ever meet Thor, don't ask him to dinner and don't steal his favorite toy. Now, that's just a silly story. We know that that's not really true, but that was something that they told to entertain each other. All right, so now, the Vikings also had this really interesting way of writing. They had their own language. Some people even called it a secret language. But the Viking letters were known as runes, and Vikings scratched their runes on wood or stone. It's easier to scratch straight lines because, whenever you're scratching into something hard, it's hard to make curves. So most of the runes are just straight lines connected in different ways. The runes would be used to go from village to village and tell different stories, spreading the stories from the Vikings. Some historians say the rune alphabet was also used for magic, for charms and spells and curses, but the truth is that they are only guessing this because some runes couldn't be understood. Most messages were simply everyday business, rather the way someone at home might leave you a message like, "Don't forget to feed the cat." So it was just everyday stuff. It just looked different, so people thought that it was magical and important. The rune alphabet is known as the Futhark, but the order of the letters is quite different than our own alphabet. We learn A, B, C, D, E, and the Vikings learned F, U, T, H as one letter, A, R, K. The Viking stories or sagas weren't written in runes. They were memorized and recited. They were finally written down 200 years after the Viking attacks had finished. They were written in Latin. 20th century writers such as J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Hobbit, said the runes were a writing of a secret language. Some rune inspirations can still be found in stones by the roadside in Scandinavia. They were written on all sorts of things found in the Viking household because pens, ink, and parchment were too expensive. The sort of things that have been found included the word kabor on a comb, and that means comb. Around the year 800 AD, the runic alphabet was reduced to just 16 letters. This is very confusing for us because one letter can have several sounds. You just have to work out which. For example, U, rune, can be read as 4 different sounds. No one knows why the alphabet was shortened this way. Okay. Now, Viking women. If you have heard a lot about Vikings, you might not have thought a lot about Viking women because they're not talked about very much. Most Vikings that you hear about are Viking men. But there were Viking women because the Vikings were married, and usually the women had to stay at home, so they didn't really get to go with the Vikings whenever they went out on their boats to attack. But Viking women stayed home and managed the farms while their husbands were away. So their husbands would give them everything they needed to stay there, and they would have to take care of everything while he's off on the ship. They could marry at 12 years old, but 15 was more usual. Something very odd for these days was that a Viking woman could divorce her husband when she wanted to. One Viking woman divorced her husband because she said he would not wear a shirt. You would receive a bride price or cash from your husband, and she got to keep that. That was very strange back then, so long ago, because most women didn't really get to keep a lot of money for themselves. But Viking women did. They also kept their own surnames after marriage. That means that, you know how women now, they have their maiden name, which is the name that their parents have. Like, my parents were Reeds, so I was Melissa Reed. But whenever I married Mr. Josh, his last name is Ownby, so I changed my last name to Ownby. Well, Viking women didn't do that. If I had been a Viking woman, then whenever I got married, I would still be Melissa Reed. I wouldn't have changed my last name to my husband's last name. They taught their daughters to cook, milk cows, churn butter, make cheese, bake bread, spin, weave, sew, and skin animals. They also learned how to swim and use weapons in case they were ever attacked. Irish historians tell stories of fighting female warriors. They could also claim land. So if a man came to a new country, then he could have as much land as he could walk around on one day, carrying a flaming torch with him. But if a woman wanted land, then she would have as much as she could walk around on, leading a cow all around. They had names like Sigrid, Tove, Thora, Ingrid, Gunhilda. They were banned from longboat raids. Longboats were the names of the ships that the Vikings used whenever they went to raid someone. But when the Vikings planned to settle on land, they would take the women with them on the ships. Women didn't become merchants or craft workers, but it wasn't all bad. There is a record of a Viking woman who won fame as a traveling poet. There's a story of a red maiden who was supposed to have been a warrior princess in northeastern Ireland for a while. They were not treated as equals to men in death. While rich men were buried on their longbows, Viking women were buried in wagons. They had to work, including combing their husband's hair to get rid of lice, because almost all Viking men had lice. They had this really long hair and these really long beards. It was kind of nasty. Okay. So here's some things you might not know about Vikings. Early Vikings had no buttons. They used brooches, and their houses had no windows. Viking blacksmiths hardened their swords by cooling them quickly in water, and sometimes even in blood. The children's song, London Bridge is Falling Down, is about a Viking attack led by Olaf. English soldiers fired arrows from the bridge into Olaf's attacking longboats. So Olaf attached ropes to the bridge's wooden legs and the other ends to his ships. The Vikings rowed away as fast as they could, and the London Bridge came falling down. The Vikings made a promise by swearing an oath on a holy ring. This was a ring that was placed on an altar and reddened with the blood of a sacrificed animal. The Vikings rarely took prisoners in sea battles because there was no room for them on the boat. So they let the losers either drown or they killed them. No one was taken on board a longboat unless they had proved they were skilled with an oar, a sword, and an axe. And Vikings shared their treasures evenly. You agreed to your share, and that's what you got. There was no fighting over how they broke up what they won in their battles. Viking food. How would you like to eat a cauldron snake? Well, probably you would, because that's what Vikings called sausage. Summers were short and cold and wet, and in winters it snowed pretty much from October all the way through February. So they didn't have a whole lot of time to grow any food. So they mostly had to hunt their food. And sometimes they were places where they didn't have a whole lot to hunt. So some of the things they ate were stewed seagull, baked seal, polar bear steak, and even roasted horse. Glad I don't have to eat with any Vikings. What about you? A Viking you wouldn't want to have tea with was called Hearthknut. He was the Viking king of England from 1040 until 1042, only 2 years. He could have had a feast set out just once a day. That's what most kings did. If guests got hungry later, they would just come by and eat some leftovers. But Hearthknut wouldn't have this. When the guests had finished a feast, he would have the tables completely cleared of all the food that was left, and then another feast was set out, and another after that. So every day, he had 4 feasts set out. Surprise, surprise, Hearthknut died young from eating and drinking too much. That wasn't a big surprise, was it? What about Viking bread? When food was scarce, Viking women made bread from flour, peas, and from pine tree bark. Now this, as you could imagine, would not taste very nice at all. It would be extremely heavy and filling and would most probably fall to the pit of your stomach like a rock. So, no Viking bread for us. Now, what happened to the Vikings? Why aren't there any Vikings around now? The English king Alfred the Great was a strong and clever ruler who did a lot for the people of the island, but so was the Viking king Nut the Great. On Saturday, which was October 14th, 1066, the grandson of a Viking, King Harold Godwinson, died at the Battle of Hastings. He was cut down by the sword of a Norman knight. The Viking age was ended and the last Viking king was gone. Or was he? Because in a roundabout way, the Vicious Vikings won in the end. First, they conquered northern France. There was a Viking that was known as Northman or Norman, and then the Norman William the Conqueror invaded Britain and won. So if Normans are Vikings, then Vikings conquered England in the end. Nobody has ever invaded and conquered Britain since. So if any of your family history goes back to where people lived in Britain since those times, it's pretty certain that you have some Viking blood. Perhaps you may find out the next time you go to the zoo. If you find yourself looking at the polar bear, thinking it looks pretty tasty, you might have some Viking blood. I'm going to send some worksheets, so if your mom, dad, whoever's teaching you at home has a chance to print them out or read them off to you, you can go through them, and there's some fun little things to do to finish out learning about the Vicious Vikings. There'll be lots of other kind of little known facts that we'll be learning with horrible histories about things that you might think you know a whole lot about. Some Egyptian facts, some facts about World War II. So we'll see you next time.